How federal funding cuts impact Hawaiʻi public broadcasting. What's next? Public broadcasting in Hawaii stays afloat for now. Imagine a scenario where your favorite local radio station is suddenly threatened with closure. This is the reality facing many public broadcasters across the United States due to recent federal funding cuts. However, in Hawaii, the impact is somewhat less severe, though not without its challenges. Federal funding reductions for public radio and television stations, which are threatening the survival of some smaller broadcasters on the mainland, are expected to have a more subdued immediate effect on Hawaii's broadcasters and their audiences. Despite the financial hits, stations here are determined to keep the lights on and the content flowing. One of the hardest hit stations in Hawaii is KKCR on Kauai, which stands to lose $83,000, or 20% of its budget, according to Annie Corpuccio, the station's executive director. Yet, KKCR listeners won't notice any immediate changes. It does put us in a precarious situation, Corpuccio acknowledged. However, she has no plans to reduce staff, cut back on Hawaiian music programming, or disable any of the station's transmitters that ensure coverage across the island. We're going to do what we do, and more, as long as we can, she emphasized. Larger public broadcasters, such as Hawaiʻi Public Radio, HPR, and PBS Hawaiʻi, have more resources to weather the storm, though they too face significant challenges. Meredith Artley, president and CEO of HPR, is launching a 2-day fundraising campaign to eliminate the station's reliance on federal funds. We can't just sit back and rely on reserves, Artley explained. We're committed to growing into a 100% community-supported organization without cutting programming or jobs. These cuts come after Congress allowed President Donald Trump to rescind approximately $1.1 billion in funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB, which distributes funds to local public television and radio stations, including HPR, PBS Hawaiʻi, and KKCR. The CPB supports stations that, in turn, pay for access to programs produced by entities like National Public Radio, NPR, and PBS. Supporters of public broadcasting argue that these stations provide essential, often life-saving information, especially in rural and underserved areas. Critics, however, claim that public radio and television programs have a liberal bias that taxpayers should not be forced to fund. But here's where it gets controversial. The decision to cut funding could be devastating for some public radio and television stations, particularly those in remote regions. U.S. Representative Jill Takuda called the House vote a significant blow to isolated communities. Public broadcasting serves as a lifeline for rural and underserved communities, providing essential educational content and emergency alerts in times of crisis, Takuda stated. We cannot afford to weaken this vital public good, especially as access to trusted information is more critical than ever. Alex Curley, a former NPR executive who has analyzed the impact of these cuts, found that stations with smaller donor bases, including Native American stations, are the most at risk. Curley has developed an Adopt a Station tool to help people identify and support stations that have lost 50% or more of their funding. For example, Oregon's KCUW lost 99% of its revenue based on 2023 data. Hawaii's broadcasters are prepared to weather the storm. While stations in Hawaii haven't been hit as hard, they are still feeling the pinch. For HPR, which serves the entire state through multiple stations and transmitters, the cut represents a 6% reduction in revenue, or $525,000. However, the station has cash reserves to cover this shortfall, thanks to years of community support and strategic planning. We have some rainy day funds. We have prepared, Artley said. This is thanks to the community that has supported us for decades, the dedicated staff, and the leadership of my predecessors who positioned HPR to weather these challenges. Similarly, PBS Hawaiʻi is well prepared, according to Ron Mizutani, the organization's president and CEO. The station has been proactive in anticipation of potential funding cuts, resulting in about $500,000 in savings from scaling back local content production. This helps offset the loss of between $1.2 million and $1.6 million annually from the CPB, which previously accounted for 18 to 22% of PBS Hawaiʻi's revenue. To adapt, PBS Hawaiʻi has reduced the number of episodes of its monthly show Home is Here from 12 to 7 and will produce 34 episodes of its Insights program instead of the usual 42. Additionally, the station has started generating revenue from its YouTube channel, with one video on housing activism drawing 7.1 million views and another on protecting native Hawaiian burial sites garnering 5.1 million views. Revenue from YouTube may be relatively small, but it's passive income from content that costs little to produce, Mizutani noted. The station has also reallocated some existing staff to enhance fundraising efforts, which has already yielded positive results. Questions loom over the future of national programming. A significant concern is the future of national programs that run on Hawaii stations, many of which are produced by other large public radio and television stations also affected by the cuts. These include popular shows like Masterpiece and Nova from WGBH in Boston and radio programs like Fresh Air from WHYY in Philadelphia and Wait Wait, Don't Tell Me from NPR and WBEZ in Chicago. Artley at HPR says the organization continuously evaluates its national programming to determine what resonates with listeners and what can be shifted to make room for more local content. However, the loss of federal funding could lead to increased costs for national programming, as fewer stations will be contributing to the production costs. But we do know that it's really likely that in addition to not having money from the CPB, other costs could go up for us, and that includes programming costs, Artley explained. We are so fortunate to not be one of the stations at risk of shutting down, but we may have to pay more. PBS Hawaiʻi faces similar uncertainties. Mizutani noted that all grant money from the CPB had to be spent on national programming, which was often produced by other stations. Now, local stations will have to use their own funds to purchase these programs directly from the producers. One potential solution is to form a consortium or hui of smaller stations to buy programs directly from producer stations, which could reduce costs by eliminating the middleman. There's content out there that people love, that we can get access to, Mizutani said. It's just a matter of how we're going to end up paying for that. It's going to take a bit to unfold. Each station is charting its own path. How each station navigates these new financial realities varies. At PBS Hawaiʻi, Mizutani is evaluating options and determining the additional funds needed to cover the loss of federal grants and purchase content. It's definitely not an emergency situation, he assured. If it is, we'll launch the Big Bird campaign, but we're not at that point. KKCR on Kauai plans to intensify its annual fundraiser in September. Corpuscio is doubling down on the station's values of serving the island with Hawaiian music and local content. She has deliberately chosen not to launch a crisis fundraiser, believing that such actions should only be taken when truly necessary. I'm not a believer in crisis fundraising, Corpuscio said. If the crisis goes away, then we look like liars. HPR, on the other hand, sees this as an opportunity to transition to full local funding. The bigger risk would be in us acting like everything was normal and not asking the community to stand with us at this moment. Artley concluded. I think the bigger risk would be us saying, let's do everything the way that we've always done it. And this is the part most people miss *, the resilience and adaptability of these stations in the face of adversity. While the future is uncertain, the commitment to serving their communities remains unwavering. What do you think about the federal funding cuts to public broadcasting? Should taxpayers continue to support these stations? Or is it time for them to become entirely self-sustaining? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Trump's cuts devastate Colorado. 52 local stations face massive budget holes. Public broadcasting faces a major crisis. Colorado's local radio and TV stations scramble to survive massive federal funding slashes. At the heart of the communities they serve, dozens of Colorado's local TV and radio stations are suddenly facing enormous financial uncertainty. Why? Because, for the first time in history, a sitting president has successfully wiped out all federal support for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB, the Kennedy-era nonprofit that delivers crucial funding to thousands of local media outlets nationwide. That president is Donald Trump. While other Republican leaders have targeted the CPB before, often criticizing organizations like NPR and PBS for alleged political bias, Trump's administration is the first to actually see such deep cuts approved. On July 18th, Congress passed a sweeping $9 billion rescission measure, clawing back $1.1 billion in CPB funding. In practical terms, this means hundreds of stations, including 52 in Colorado, now face gaping holes in their budgets. For almost half a century, lawmakers from both major parties understood how vital public TV and radio are, especially for rural America, explained Tammy Graham, executive director of KSUT, a unique station that provides critical news and emergency updates to tribal nations in the Four Corners region. But that consensus seems to have disappeared overnight. KSUT's story is especially poignant. It was among the first radio stations founded and operated by an indigenous tribal nation and has always prioritized coverage on Native issues for the Southern Ute, Ute Mountain Ute, Jicarilla Apache, and large parts of the Navajo Nation. The loss of federal dollars is a direct blow, leaving KSUT $330,000 short, an astonishing 20% of its total annual budget. Without this money, Graham says, the station may be forced to axe national and international programming like NPR's Morning Edition, BBC World News, and shows such as Native Voice One, a crucial, hour-long talk program serving indigenous communities. Nearby stations are caught in the same storm. KDUR, broadcasting from Fort Lewis College, is also facing a 20% budget cut. KSJD, another Durango area station, has lost a full third of its budget. Some tribal stations technically have a legal pathway to reclaim revoked funding thanks to a carve-out in the cuts, but Graham is not hopeful. Honestly, it feels like a token gesture at best, or a political trade at worst. We're on the list, but I doubt the money will ever arrive. The controversy goes even further. In May, KSUT joined Colorado Public Radio and Aspen Public Radio in filing a lawsuit against Trump, arguing that gutting CPB funding via executive order is an assault on free speech protections. When it comes to Native Voice One or similar shows, you have to consider, these are communities that rarely get their perspectives amplified. The cuts just perpetuate that neglect. But here's the thing most people don't realize. This fight over public broadcasting isn't new at all. It started with the very founding of the CPB in 1967, when lawmakers, worried about commercial interests diluting educational and cultural programming, passed the Public Broadcasting Act. Yet, just 5 years later, President Richard Nixon tried to pull the plug after objecting to news coverage he deemed liberal. Congress ultimately kept the CPB alive, as did subsequent attempts by Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Newt Gingrich to cut its funding. Each time, bipartisan pushback and the recognition of public media's importance kept those efforts in check. Until now, why did Trump finally succeed? Some speculate that, with the rise of the internet, many Americans are less dependent on traditional public media, making cuts politically safer. But does that really make sense, especially for rural and tribal areas? In remote communities, high-speed internet is not a given. Sometimes it's barely available. When a wildfire, flood, or other disaster strikes, locals rely on their radio stations for life-saving information and breaking news, said Graham. Tim Russo, KGNU station manager in Boulder, agrees. KGNU is preparing for a 15% budget shortfall, $155,000, and will have to make tough choices. Public media funding typically comes in two forms: unrestricted dollars, supporting operations, staff, and facility maintenance, and restricted money, earmarked for content and emergency broadcast systems. When disaster hits, think about the Formula wildfires, the Gold Hill fires, or the historic flooding that's battered Colorado. It's the nimble, hyperlocal response of stations like KGNU that communities depend on, Russo emphasized. But, he warns, there's hardly any excess to cut. Our station is run on a shoestring, held together by a dedicated web of more than 400 volunteers, about 200 of whom go on air directly. The community support is amazing, but when the budget tightens this much, it's nearly impossible to find further savings. We don't have big financial reserves. Rural Colorado in double jeopardy. On Colorado's vast eastern plains, things are even more challenging. High Plains Public Radio, HPPR, which operates KCSE in Lamar and KZNK in Brewster, Kansas, serves counties where public media is often the only source of accessible news. Losing close to $500,000, 15% of the budget over 2 years, will force HPPR to make fundamental changes, including possibly reducing the broadcast power of its stations. A move that could mean whole towns simply lose public radio service if they travel outside a newly reduced signal area. Does the government really want to deprive rural families of their trusted local sources? HPPR Executive Director Quentin Hope shared that the organization is scrambling to find ways to adapt, launching fundraising drives and planning for an eventual endowment to ensure operational independence. Yet, as HPPR's Development Director Abby Killingsworth pointed out, serving vast, sparsely populated regions poses unique obstacles. Even with above-average local donations, the population is simply too small to cover the loss. Federal funding has long been the linchpin that keeps these stations on the air for rural listeners. So what now? For HPPR and so many other stations, these cuts are forcing a return to the drawing board, reimagining their mission, slashing costs, and stretching remaining funds as far as possible. We have to reinvent ourselves for this new reality, Killingsworth said. We can't dwell on what's lost. We have to move forward with what we have. At some larger stations like KGNU in Boulder and KUNC in Greeley, there's hope that generous community support might help bridge the financial gap. Yet, Russo fears it's the rural and tribal stations, those with the smallest donor bases and the largest coverage areas, that will suffer the most, unless their communities step up in an unprecedented way. Here's the part that could heat up any dinner table debate. Is it fair or wise to strip away support for public media in areas where private investment can't, and won't, fill the void? Should public radio and TV be left to sink or swim in the marketplace, even when doing so would silence critical local and tribal